Members of the military pay out of pocket for some parts of their uniforms, but the cost can vary significantly. The Government Accountability Office says the Defense Department can do more to track these cost disparities and address them. Won Sherman is Acting Director for Defense Capabilities and Management Issues at GAO. Thanks for joining me, Tina. You looked at the cost disparities among services and genders. What did you find?
Well, Congress asked us to look at the costs of uniform items that are paid out of pocket by enlisted service members and officers. They were interested in this in particular because uniforms are an important part of the military experience, and they wanted to see whether or not there were cost differences that exist across the services and between females and males. Additionally, the department has a set of principles that guide its compensation for the military, one of which is equity. And that principle closely ties the morale of service members to a sense of fairness. So the greater the fairness, the greater and higher the morale. So when we looked at this issue, we found that although females and males both pay out of pocket for some uniform items, female service members, enlisted and officers pay more out of pocket to replace those items than their male counterparts.
And was that true in all the services?
Across the services, there were differences, yes.
But did you also find differences in the services that perhaps in some the costs were higher than in others?
Absolutely, we did. There were differences that ran the spectrum. For example, we looked at uniform items over the past 5 years. And in looking at those items, we found that females were on average paying more than their male counterparts, between 8 and 15% more out of pocket to replace those uniform items.
We're talking about the parts that they pay out of pocket for. Which uniforms are they responsible for buying out of pocket?
They're responsible for, and we looked at all uniforms that you could think of, from combat uniforms to their dress wear. And so the uniform items include everything from hats and shirts all the way to socks, shoes, and dress coats.
Did you get a sense of what the total cost in a year was for men and women in the service?
Well, when we were looking at the costs, for example, the initial items that are provided on the enlisted service member side to them average between $1,600 and $2,400. But then one analysis that we did carry out was we projected out-of-pocket costs over 20 years. And what we found was that female enlisted service members, again, were paying more out of pocket than males were, as much as over $8,000 to replace their uniform items.
What recommendations did you make for how DoD can address this?
We made 3 recommendations to the military services and 1 to the Department of Defense. The first 2 recommendations to the services were to develop consistent reasons for which uniform items they would pay to replace, because we found inconsistency, of course, in those items. And then also to periodically review those items to ensure that there are consistency in the payment that's provided to replace those items, and also to help address any out-of-pocket differences that they might have identified as part of that periodic review. The third recommendation we made to the services was to submit a plan to the department for any proposed uniform changes that they made, because we found that there were 18 uniform changes the services made over the past decade, 2/3 of which affected both females and males, but 1/3 that only affected females, and that created a great impact on the female officers. So we suggested or recommended that the services provide those plans with costs estimated in them to the department for review. And then, because senior leadership is so important on this issue, we recommended that the department review the plan to determine whether or not there are any differences and to make suggestions in order to ensure equity and compensation.
You note that they have been introducing these new pieces or requirements. I assume that typically increases the cost?
Yes, that was something that we identified, and for enlisted service members, they would receive some type of money to replace or to purchase new uniforms. But for officers, outside of an initial $400 that they receive when they report for active duty, they're expected to pay out of pocket to purchase any additional items, to replace uniform items, or when the services change the uniforms, to purchase those new uniform items.
And Tina, what was DoD's response to your recommendations?
The department had several responses to our recommendations. Actually, I worked with a great team, and we were very excited to learn that one of the services has already taken steps to implement our recommendations in terms of making adjustments to the money provided to replace certain uniform items. And then specifically, the department, when reviewing our recommendations, stated that they believed it was not appropriate to address any and all out-of-pocket cost differences for uniform items to replace them, or if there were any changes, and that they would develop a standard in order to determine which of those differences were the most significant and take action as a result. So we are very interested in watching what the department develops in terms of that standard and how they will work to implement it.
Thanks for joining me, Tina.
Thank you.